So the essential premise of the social construct, which is applied in Breaking the Code of History, is a 5-stage model. So stage 1 is regionalization driven by demographics. The system expands. It reaches a point where demographically there are more numerous people. Power is narrowly held at the top. It's quite left-brained as an iterative and controlling, and some injustice then challenge the system. Revolution unfolds, and gradually civil war breaks out. And that civil war is really quite Darwinistic. It's the removal of enfranchised, limited thought processes to a much more right-brain creative energy, which allows the system to expand. And through the Darwinistic process of a civil war, these people rise to the fore as are the most naturally capable leaders. So by the end of a civil war, you end up with far more right-brain leadership, which is creative and expansive, and you've militarized the system to then run down the resource chains, and off you are at the end of stage 1, moving to stage 2. And every system that I studied went through this first stage. The second stage is if there is space to move into and there's no hegemon sitting on top of them, they expand down their resource chains. They become wealthy exponentially at a rate that staggers their neighbours. They usually have a number of USPs that make them unique, usually military USPs, organisational USPs, and they start agglomerating. So you take one unit and now you've got 2 units. And then you had 2 units versus 1 unit. Now you've got 3 units. And the speed of expansion is quite shocking because most human beings see the past, present and future as a straight line. So non-linear change catches everyone on the hop. And today that would be China. If you go back to when we spoke, the idea that China could be on economic parity with America was just unacceptable to the world. And yet here we are 7 years later. So that's a good example of a shocking exponential change. And then at some stage, the expansion stops and it just can't go any further. And there's a pause and the empire or the organization finds itself at the limits of its expansion. It can't go out any further and it stops and it has a pause and it becomes highly integrative and tolerant because at the core, people have huge amounts of wealth. They're stable. They've probably separated themselves from the environment and food and all the issues in previous empires that created uncertainty. Their religious paradigms start to change and they're very tolerant. So the peak of an empire is very tolerant, surprisingly, until at the top there's some kind of civil war. And that civil war is about the energy doesn't go out anymore and it stays in and it starts to fight between ideals, concepts, and that's the beginning of the system tearing itself apart. Empires are not dwarfed by another system at their peak. They start ripping themselves apart from the inside. And then they start to move into overextension, where in effect financially and morally they start to lose traction. But the momentum of the system means that most people are blind to that beginning of decline. And then there's a 9/11 moment, which was for America exactly that, a moment where you never come back, you change your behavior and you slide down the process and you decline into a process where all of your organizational structure disintegrates.
Okay.
So that premise was applied to every empire I could find in the world. And then we essentially used the model to create 5 stages or 5 phases of a system. And then we could locate every country on that system and start to understand how it was behaving and what it was going to do.